When I look at Russian history over the last 30 years, what it made me realize how fragile democracy is. And this is a very, very important point. And that point doesn't just apply to Russia, but to any democracy. So what's my opinion on Russia before it invaded Ukraine versus now? When I was growing up in the Soviet Union, I and everybody around me look at one of the most devastating events in the 20th century was World War II. And at the time, we looked at Nazi Germany as a bad actor, Soviet Union as a good actor. And I remember watching hundreds, maybe thousands of movies about World War II, where it was, you have a peaceful Soviet Union and suddenly German bombers fly into this peace and start dropping bombs and killing civilians. And I think that's exactly what happened. And I think Germans was wrong. Germany was an aggressor, and they killed millions of people, and they weren't wrong. I would never imagine that Russia, the country I grew up in, would be doing the same thing to Ukraine today, killing tens of thousands. I don't know how many people they killed, tens of thousands of people for just basically because they feel that Ukraine should belong to Russia. I mean, that's really it. I mean, whatever arguments you hear about NATO, etc., whenever you hear about those arguments, they really make so little sense, especially if you look at how little European countries spend on defense. I mean, we own a lot of defense companies, and I tell you, you look at Germany, for instance, like NFL could have invaded. Germany was so poorly equipped. NFL could have invaded Germany. How poorly were they equipped? So NATO was not a threat to Russia at all. Nobody, the irony of this is that there is a Russians, I have a lot of, I have some high school friends who I talk to at times, and they had this lot of self-importance, like Americans on NATO hate them. I think Americans think so little about Russia. We want very little, the concern to America is actually not even Russia, but China. I look at this war, and basically what I see is kind of Russian imperialism, which is not that much different from German imperialism. Russia is basically invading Ukraine, and if you look at the way Russians look at Ukrainians, it's not that much different the way Germans look at the rest of the world. Aryans were better people, their lives are more valuable, and that's how Hitler justified Germany invading other countries and killing civilians. And if you read the Russian press, it's kind of very similar. Ukrainians are for them first of all, they call them Nazis, which I think is ironic because they might as well call them Russians because Russia today is behaving just like Nazi Germany did. But also they just basically, the way they talk about Ukraine is this is a country that has no right to exist. And Putin is basically what he's trying to do, he's trying to put the band back together. What's sad about this whole situation, Russian people are incredibly brainwashed. And it's very difficult for us to understand the level of how brainwashed they are. The propaganda machine in Russia is incredibly powerful. It's almost as powerful, probably as powerful as it was in Nazi Germany. Many Russians think that NATO was on the brink of invading them. Many Russians think that Ukraine is infested with Nazis. It's almost like Russia lives in its own version of the Truman Show. So when I look at Russia today, I feel very embarrassed. I'm very ashamed for how this country is behaving. One thing I realized when I look at Russian history over the last 30 years, what it made me realize how fragile democracy is. And this is a very, very important point. And that point doesn't just apply to Russia, but to any democracy. When I left Russia in 1991, it turned into democracy. And I would argue for the next 8 or 9 years, it was a democracy. And then when Putin came to power, people loved him, and people loved him. And every time he asked for a little bit more power, they gave it to him. They would write a constitution to accommodate him. And little by little, as he got more and more powerful, he started to care about people a little bit less and less. And he always, about him more and more. When the absolute power collapsed absolutely, I think just all power corrupts. Not I mean absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Power is addictive. And therefore, when I look at the United States, and what I think, what's really incredible about the United States Constitution and about American people, how they look at the government, we never create law for one person. We always create laws for the system. In Russia, people created laws to fit the president they have at the time. So as Putin rewrote, changed the laws little by little, he basically became a dictator. And all the checks and balances are gone now. And therefore, I think Russia is going back to dictatorial Stalin regime. By the way, already they are erecting monuments, Stalin monuments again. And now, when 10, 20 years ago, Stalin was a horrible dictator that killed tens of millions of people in Russia. Now they're saying he was a complex individual. And Solzhenitsyn now is a liar in Russia again. These are my thoughts on Russia, I guess.